Okay, now let's go over Chapter 14, Spinal Cord and Nerves. So the spinal cord is going to extend inferiorly from the brain's medulla through the vertebral canal. It's going to be subdivided into 5 parts from top to bottom. There's the cervical part, which is the superiormost part. It's going to consist of 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves. There's the thoracic part. That's going to be composed of 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves. The lumbar part, 5 pairs of lumbar spinal nerves. The sacral part, 5 pairs of sacral spinal nerves. And then at the very bottom, the inferior tip of the spinal cord is going to be the coccygeal part, where there's going to be 1 pair of coccygeal spinal nerves. So all together, there's going to be 31 spinal nerves that exit the spinal cord. Okay, so you can see here near the top of the spinal cord, the superiormost portion is going to be the cervical part. Moving downwards, you have the thoracic part. It's going to be composed of 12 spinal nerves, 12 pairs of spinal nerves. Then you have the lumbar part, 5 pairs of spinal nerves. The sacral part, 5 pairs of sacral nerves. And then the most inferior part down here, 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. Now recall that there are 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 cervical nerves. So this means that the nerves in the cervical part are going to come out above their corresponding vertebra. So C1, the nerve, is going to come out above C1, the vertebra. C2, the nerve, is going to come out above C2, the vertebra. All the way down here to C8. And C8 is going to be at the junction of the cervical and the thoracic spine. So C8, instead of coming out above C8, because there is no C8 vertebra, comes out above the T1 vertebra. Okay, and then at this point we're going to switch over to thoracic nerves, and you'll notice here the thoracic nerves come out below their corresponding vertebra. So T1, the spinal nerve, is going to come out below T1, the vertebra. T2, the spinal nerve, is going to come out below T2, the vertebra. And that is going to continue down all the way through the rest of the spinal cord. Okay, come over to this picture of the spinal cord. And first, let's orient ourselves. These are going to be the thoracic vertebrae. We know that because there are ribs coming off of them. This is going to be T12. And then you can see here's L1, the first of the lumbar vertebrae. And we know that because there's no rib. So this is L1, L2, L3, L4, L5 down here. Here's the spinal cord coming through the thoracic part. And then right here is what's called the conus medullaris, and this is the tapered end of the spinal cord. And you can see it is kind of tapering here to a point where it's going to then transition into the cauda equina. The conus medullaris appears at about the level of L1, which this is consistent with. From it, we said there's going to be the cauda equina, which is kind of like the nerve rootlets for the lower spinal nerves. From the conus medullaris, also the phylum terminale is going to descend, and this is a band of connective tissue that's going to connect the spinal cord to the vertebral column. If we go up here, we can see posterior rootlets coming off of the spinal cord. These are going to convalesce to join in and join together to make the posterior roots. Posterior roots come out, forming the spinal nerve, and here is a swelling near the posterior root, and this is going to be the posterior root ganglion. This is where those cell bodies of these neurons are located. Okay, some questions here. Which section of the vertebral column contains the most vertebrae? Cervical is going to contain 7. Thoracic is going to contain 12. Lumbar is going to contain 5. And the sacrum has 5 vertebrae fused together. So the most there is going to be the thoracic part of the vertebral column because there are 12 thoracic vertebrae. How many pairs of spinal nerves exit the spinal cord? Well, if you go back and remember, here we go. There's going to be 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar spinal nerves, 5 pairs of sacral spinal nerves, and 1 pair of coccygeal spinal nerves. So add all of these up together, and you're going to get 31 pairs. So spinal cord size and shape is going to vary depending on what part of the spinal cord you're looking at, but it's going to be cylindrical overall. If you take a cross section, you can see the difference here in the different parts of the spinal cord. You can see the cervical part. Here's a section from it. Here's a section from the thoracic part. And here's a section from the lumbar part. You can see sort of the anatomical differences here between the different sections. Cross-section is also going to show us the grooves on the spinal cord. So you have the anterior groove, or the anterior median fissure, and the posterior groove, or the posterior median sulcus. Also note the gray matter here is labeled. So you have the anterior horn, you have the lateral horn, and you have the posterior horn. Lateral horn is only going to be in the thoracic section, okay? Just like in the brain, the spinal cord has meninges. They are the same 3 layers. So you have the pia mater, which is going to be the delicate layer that adheres directly to the spinal cord. You have the arachnoid mater. This is that web-like layer that's just above the pia mater. And that space in between is called the subarachnoid space. This is the area between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. And it's where CSF flows. Next, you have the dura mater. This is the outermost layer of meninges. You have the subdural space, which is going to be between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. And you have the epidural space. This is going to be between the dura mater and the vertebra. And the epidural space is going to house adipose and areolar connective tissue along with blood vessels. Okay, here's a cross-section of the spinal cord within a vertebra. This is the anterior portion, and this is the posterior region. Looking at the spinal cord here, you can see there's a layer of meninges directly on it. This is going to be the pia mater. We go a little bit further out. We're going to have the arachnoid mater. And further out from that is going to be the dura mater. The space between the dura mater and the vertebra is going to be the epidural space. So this region right here is going to be the epidural space. The region between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is going to be the subarachnoid space. And that's going to be the region where CSF flows. I also want to draw your attention to the nerves here. So here is a spinal nerve coming out from the spinal cord. If we go back a little bit further, we can see, let's go to this side. Here's the spinal nerve. If we go back a little bit further, we can see here's the dorsal root ganglion, right? That swelling that has cell bodies of neurons, sensory neurons. Go back a little bit further, here's the posterior root, okay, and that's going to be what comes directly off of the spinal cord. Follow it back this way, so here's the spinal nerve, we're going back. This section here is going to be the anterior root, which comes off of the spinal cord, okay? So the anterior root is going to be primarily motor neurons that control your skeletal muscle. And they're going to combine here with the sensory neurons of the posterior root. So a spinal nerve is always going to be a mixed nerve. It's going to have a motor component and a sensory component in it. Alright, so let's look at it from another angle. Here you have a spinal cord. Directly on the spinal cord is going to be that thin connective tissue layer, the pia mater. You go further out from that, you have the arachnoid mater. And this area between pia mater and arachnoid mater is going to be the subarachnoid space. Going from arachnoid mater further out, you have dura mater. And the space between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater is going to be the subdural space. If you went further out from the dura mater here, you would hit bone. And the space between bone and dura mater is the epidural space. You can see here is the spinal nerve from this point onwards. Tracing it back, we have the posterior root ganglion. Then we have the posterior root. And the posterior root is composed of a bunch of branches or little bundles of neurons. And these are the posterior rootlets, and they come directly off of the spinal cord. Go back to the spinal nerve. Tracing it back towards the spinal cord again, you have the anterior root. And the anterior root is going to be composed of a bunch of anterior rootlets coming directly off the spinal cord. All right, lumbar puncture, I want you to know for your test. This is going to be a procedure for obtaining cerebrospinal fluid for medical diagnosis. So, for example, a patient comes in with suspected meningitis. You take a sample of their cerebrospinal fluid and you're looking for microorganisms in it, white blood cells in it, and other signs of infection. What happens is you take a needle and you pass it through the skin, the back muscles, and the ligamentum flavum. You're going to then hit the epidural space, and then you're going to puncture through the dura mater. Then you're going to puncture through the arachnoid mater, and when you do that, you're going to hit the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is where the cerebrospinal fluid is. So, if a test question asked you what space fluid from a spinal tap was coming from, you would answer subarachnoid space. It's important to note that the adult spinal cord ends at the level of L1. Remember, we said the conus medullaris is typically at L1 level. So you have to do a lumbar puncture below L1 to ensure your needle does not puncture the spinal cord itself. So typically they give themselves a lot of space and they enter the needle right around the L4 vertebrae. So they're going to go in the skin through the intervertebral space, right? They're going to go in between those spinous processes of the vertebrae. puncture skin, puncture muscle, puncture the ligamentum flavum. And remember, the ligamentum flavum is composed of it's the ligament that holds the adjacent vertebrae, helps hold them together, the lamina of adjacent vertebrae. So you need a puncture through that. Then you're going to hit the epidural space, and again you're going to puncture through the dura mater, then puncture through the arachnoid mater, and then you're going to be in the subarachnoid space, the space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, and that's where you're going to get your CSF. Okay, so gray matter in the spinal cord. This is going to be the neuron cell bodies, dendrites, and then unmyelinated axons. It's also going to be composed of interneurons. It's found in the center of the spinal cord and has a butterfly shape. So remember, gray matter in the spinal cord is going to be on the interior, and white matter is going to be on the exterior. And that's the opposite from the brain, where gray matter was primarily on the exterior, and white matter primarily on the interior. Gray matter in the spinal cord is going to be divided into 4 compartments. You have the anterior horns. We said these are going to be cell bodies of motor neurons, somatic motor neurons. These guys innervate skeletal muscle. You then have the lateral horns. I said it's going to primarily be in the thoracic section, T1 through L2. This is going to be composed of cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons. Autonomic motor neurons innervate the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands throughout the body. Then you have the posterior horns. This is going to be composed of axons of sensory neurons and the cell bodies of interneurons. Okay, so this image is showing gray matter and white matter in the spinal cord. Kind of to orient yourself, remember this is the anterior side and this is the posterior side. So in the front you have the anterior median fissure, and in the back you have the posterior median sulcus. The white matter surrounds the butterfly-shaped gray matter in the center of the spinal cord. The gray matter is going to have posterior horn. If you're in the thoracic section, T1 to L2, you're going to have the lateral horn, and you're going to have the anterior horn. You can also subdivide the white matter into funiculi. So you have the posterior funiculi, which is kind of like this bundle here, posterior funiculus, excuse me. You have the lateral funiculus, this bundle here of white matter, and the anterior funiculus, which is going to be this bundle of white matter. Again, you see the anterior rootlets coming together to form the anterior root, joining the posterior root to form the spinal nerve. Here you can see on a transverse section of spinal cord, you can see the posterior horn, the lateral horn, and the anterior horn of the gray matter. Okay, you have the gray commissure. This is going to be that horizontal band of gray matter surrounding the central canal. So going back, you can see that right here. It surrounds the central canal, and it's going to connect the left and right halves of gray matter. You can see it here on cross section. Gray commissure. It's going to contain unmyelinated axons, and again connects the left and right gray matter. Functional groups of cell bodies, remember, are going to be called nuclei. There are sensory nuclei in the posterior horn. In other words, cell bodies in the posterior horn of interneurons. Don't get this confused with the cell bodies of sensory neurons, which are housed in the posterior root ganglion. So here is the posterior root ganglion. This is going to be the cell bodies of these neurons that come from, say, the skin of the foot. That neuron is going to come up here. Here's its cell body, and then the rest of its axon is going to go this way. And it's going to synapse here in the posterior horn with interneurons. And the cell bodies of those interneurons are going to be located in the posterior horn. We have somatic sensory nuclei. This is the cell bodies of interneurons that receive signals from the skin, the muscles, and the joints. And we have visceral sensory nuclei. This is going to be the cell bodies of interneurons that receive signals from blood vessels and your organs. Okay, the anterior and lateral horns of the gray matter are going to contain the cell bodies of motor neurons. And these are called motor nuclei. You have the somatic motor nuclei, and you have the autonomic motor nuclei. The somatic motor nuclei, as you might have guessed, are going to be cell bodies that send signals to skeletal muscles, okay? Somatic meaning pertaining to the body. So when you think of the body, think of how it moves and how it needs skeletal muscles to move. The somatic motor nuclei are going to be basically the gray matter that composes the anterior horn. Autonomic motor nuclei, on the other hand, are going to be the motor neuron cell bodies that send signals to smooth muscle, heart, and glands. So this is going to be the neurons that send the signals from the brain to your abdominal organs, essentially, and your heart. And these are going to be located in the lateral horn of the gray matter. Again, from T1 to L2, about L2. Okay, so the posterior root ganglion, we said, is going to house sensory neuron cell bodies. The posterior horn is going to house those sensory axons, as well as interneurons, and the cell bodies of those interneurons. The lateral horn is going to house autonomic motor cell bodies. And the anterior horn is going to house those somatic motor neuron cell bodies, the motor neurons to the skeletal muscle. And I'll show you what I mean right here. Okay, let's start here in the anterior horn. The gray matter here, you're going to have neuron cell bodies of motor neurons, somatic motor neurons, right? So these guys are going to leave the spinal cord, compose the part of the anterior root. The anterior root is going to join with the posterior root and form a spinal nerve. Now, these motor neurons, you can see, are the dark red line here. They're going to go out, somatic motor neurons are going to go out and innervate the skeletal muscle. So, say, the skeletal muscle of the foot. Come back here. Let's look at the lateral horn. This is going to be autonomic motor neurons. So the cell bodies here are in the lateral horn. They leave the spinal cord. They form the rest of that anterior root. And so the whole anterior root is going to be motor. It's going to be signals from the CNS to your skeletal muscle and signals from the CNS to your viscera. So here we're following the autonomic motor neuron out. It joins with the posterior root here. And now we're in the spinal nerve, right? This has got both motor and sensory components. And if you follow the autonomic motor neuron all the way out, you might see that it is, say, connected. It synapses with cells in the heart. Okay, so it takes signals from the brain to the heart, and perhaps it helps control heart rate. Okay, now let's look at the posterior root components. You have somatic sensory neurons. Okay, and so this is going to be a neuron that's coming from, say, the skin of the foot. So it receives a signal from the foot. It comes up here, it comes up here. Here's its cell body. The signal continues propagating this way down the axon. And here in the posterior root, it is going to synapse with cell bodies of interneurons. So remember, the posterior root is going to have axons from the sensory neurons, as well as cell bodies from the interneurons. These interneurons can go on to synapse with motor neurons again. So you may get a signal from your foot that's painful, and that signal is going to propagate, and it's going to be sent straight to the motor side to withdraw your foot from that painful signal. It will also send a signal up here. This axon to this interneuron is going to ascend the spinal tract and head up towards the brain. Okay, so you'll get a signal to your motor neurons, as well as a signal to your brain to tell you, hey, there's something painful down here, check it out. Okay, and last we have the visceral sensory neuron. So this again is going to be a neuron bringing information from the body to the brain. And let's say that this is a sensory neuron on the heart. And let's say that you start to have a heart attack. Well, pain from the heart muscle is going to be conveyed through the visceral sensory neurons. And again, the cell bodies of these neurons are going to be located in the posterior root ganglion. And that signal is going to be propagated up to the gray matter of the spinal cord, where it's going to synapse on interneurons. Okay, and these interneurons can then communicate again with motor neurons, or they can ascend, the axon can ascend the spinal tract up to the brain and take the signal, bring the message to your consciousness, to your brain. And this is just a more zoomed in view for you to look at these synapses here in a little bit better detail. Okay, we talked a little bit about white matter. Remember, this is going to be myelinated axons of the neurons, and they're going to and from the brain. We mentioned the three regions, the funiculi. Remember, there's the posterior funiculus, the lateral funiculus, and the anterior funiculus, and these are just bundles of axons ascending or descending through the spinal cord. The posterior funiculus is this region right here, and it's going to be composed of sensory tracts. So myelinated axons of the sensory neurons only. Now the lateral funiculus, this is going to be here. This whole region is the lateral funiculus. It's going to contain both ascending and descending tracts. So it's got information coming from the body, sensory neurons, and it's got information going to the body, motor neurons. And then finally the anterior funiculus, which is going to be right here anterior funiculus. It's going to also contain ascending and descending tracts. So again, you have information coming from the body to the brain, that's sensory, and information going from the brain to the body, that's motor. All right, we already said this, that the CNS is going to communicate with the rest of the body through those spinal pathways, and those spinal pathways are going to be either sensory or motor. And remember, spinal pathways are just tracts. They're just the axons, the kind of the highway that the impulse from the brain to the body or from the body to the brain is traveling. You have the sensory pathways. Those are going to be the ascending tracts. These guys send signals from the body through the spinal cord to the brain. And then you're going to have the motor pathways, or the descending tracts. And these guys send signals away from the brain through the spinal cord to the rest of the body, to muscles or glands. Spinal cord conduction pathways. We've touched on this already. The common locations of neuron components. Axons are going to be in the spinal cord tracts. Cell bodies are going to be in the ganglia, the gray horns of the spinal cord, and the gray matter of the brain. A pathway is going to be composed of two or more neurons communicating with each other. Tracts are always going to be paired. There's a left tract and a right tract. And then decussation. Most pathways decussate. That is, the axons cross the midline so that the brain is processing information from the opposite or contralateral side. The vast majority of pathways are going to cross over. About 85 to 90%. There's going to be uncrossed pathways. And when that happens, they're going to bring information to and from the ipsilateral, or the same side of the body. Okay, so let's talk about sensory pathways first. Sensory or ascending pathways are going to take the signals for proprioception, touch, temperature, pressure, and pain, and relay that information to the brain. You have somatosensory pathways that carry signals from the skin, the muscles, and the joints to the brain. And you have viscerosensory pathways, and this is going to carry signals from your organs to the brain. We have specific terms for the neurons in these pathways, depending on where their location is. So primary or first order neuron is going to be the neuron that picks up the signal. It has the ending that communicates with the body. So, for example, a neuron that picks up pain from the skin of your foot is going to be a first order neuron. Now, this neuron's cell body is going to be in the posterior root ganglion, and its axon is going to lead to the secondary or second order neuron. The second order neuron is an interneuron. It's going to receive input from the first order neuron, and then it's going to take that input and extend it to either another neuron called a tertiary neuron or to the brain. The tertiary neuron, which is the third order neuron, is also going to be an interneuron, and what it does is it's going to receive input from the secondary or second order neuron, and it's going to relay it to the somatosensory cortex of the brain. Okay, so let's look at a sensory pathway. Let's look at the posterior funiculus medial lemniscal pathway. So, what's going to happen is you're going to have a neuron, a sensory neuron here, and it has a receptor for, let's say, touch from the hand. So that touch sensation is going to be relayed by this sensory neuron, the first order neuron, and its axon goes into the spinal cord, into the gray matter of the spinal cord, and it is going to ascend the spinal cord. So this axon is ascending up the spinal cord until we get to the medulla oblongata. Here, the medulla oblongata, this first order neuron, remember this is that sensory neuron that detected the sensation of touch. It is going to synapse with an interneuron. This interneuron is the second order neuron. At the medulla oblongata, most of these neurons are going to be crossing over. So this second order neuron is going to cross over, and it's going to ascend even further. Second order neuron ascends. Here in the midbrain, we see a section in this area here is called the medial lemniscus, and it's going to be composed of a bunch of these neurons ascending from these pathways. Okay, so it's ascending until it gets to the brain, and it's going to synapse with an interneuron in the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is the relay center for sensory information. Now, this is a third order neuron. The third order neuron is going to take that information from the thalamus and relay it to the primary somatosensory cortex in the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe of the brain, of the cerebrum. And that, in a nutshell, is how an ascending pathway works. Now, a descending pathway would be very similar, except the neurons would start up in the brain, right, and descend down through the spinal cord. Okay, so here's motor pathways. Motor pathways, or descending pathways, are going to control effectors such as skeletal muscles. Like we said, they're going to start in the brain, and they're going to descend. It's going to include at least 2 neurons. There's the upper motor neuron, which is going to be the neuron that originates in the brain. And then there's the lower motor neuron, which is going to be the neuron that communicates with the muscle. Okay, so we have a direct pathway and we have an indirect pathway. Let's talk about the direct or pyramidal pathway first. This is responsible for conscious control of your skeletal muscles. It's going to begin with the upper motor neurons in the primary motor cortex, right? And these axons are going to end either in the brainstem or in the spinal cord. If they end in the brainstem, they're called corticobulbar tracts, and if they end in the spinal cord, they're called corticospinal tracts. I want to focus on the corticospinal tracts. These guys descend from the primary motor cortex, they go through the brainstem, and then they go into the spinal cord. And then they're going to synapse on the lower motor neurons in the anterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. And I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so here you have the left side of the body and the right side of the body. This is the primary motor cortex in the precentral gyrus of the brain. This is where the cell body of your upper motor neuron is going to be, here hanging out in this gray matter of the cerebrum. You're going to think a thought, so I want to move my hand, and you're going to send that impulse to move your hand down the corticospinal tract. This is the upper motor neuron So the impulse goes down the upper motor neuron. When it gets here, it becomes the part of the corticospinal tract. You're going to go through the midbrain, composing the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain. You're going to go down through the medulla oblongata. This is all still just the primary, the first order neuron here, the upper motor neuron. Excuse me. You're going to go through the medulla oblongata, and remember, most of the tracks are going to cross over, but a few are not. And then you're going to go into the spinal cord. And when you get to the level of the spinal cord that you want to control your hand, these upper motor neurons are going to synapse here. And you can see there's a synapse here between interneurons in the gray matter. And then these interneurons will communicate that signal to the lower motor neurons. Lower motor neurons propel that signal to the skeletal muscle and deliver that impulse, and then the muscles of the hand contract. Okay, and then you have indirect motor pathways. This is where the motor commands are going to occur on a subconscious or a reflexive level. And these upper motor neurons are going to originate with the brainstem and control our reflexive movements, which do not always reach conscious level. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. Okay, this should just be kind of a recap of the spinal nerve characteristics we've learned so far. So remember, there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves. You're going to identify them by the first letter of the region of the spinal cord, and then the number. So, for example, the first cervical nerve is going to be C1, and then you've got the coccygeal nerve, CO1. Each spinal nerve is formed by two roots coming together. You have the anterior root, which is going to contain only motor neurons, only motor axons, and the cell bodies are going to be located in the lateral and anterior horns of the spinal cord. And then you have the posterior root, which is going to contain sensory axons only. And remember, the cell bodies of these neurons are going to be found in the posterior root ganglion. So going back, you can see the anterior root is going to be totally motor axons, and the posterior root is going to be completely sensory axons. The cell bodies of the sensory neurons are here in the posterior root ganglion, and the cell bodies of the motor neurons are here in the gray matter, the lateral horn and the anterior horn of the spinal cord. All right, let's talk a little bit about reflexes now. A reflex is going to be a rapid and involuntary response to a stimulus. It's something you don't even think about. It just happens quickly and subconsciously. All reflexes are going to have similar properties. There's going to be a stimulus that's required to initiate the reflex. The reflex is going to involve a rapid response with a chain of only a few neurons. The response is pre-programmed, that is, it is always the same. And the response is involuntary. It requires no intent or awareness of the reflex before it happens. A reflex is a survival mechanism. This is how we respond to potentially detrimental stimuli. It helps us respond immediately, and awareness comes to us after we have already responded to the stimulus. Okay, so how does a reflex occur? Well, there's several components of a reflex arc. The stimulus is going to activate a sensory receptor. So that's your first component. And remember, sensory receptors are out there in your body, and they are what respond to touch, temperature, pressure, etc. That sensory neuron picks up the information and it's going to transmit the nerve signal to the CNS, specifically the spinal cord. Information is going to be processed by interneurons in the spinal cord, or perhaps no interneuron if it's a simple reflex. A motor neuron is going to transmit a nerve signal from the spinal cord to the effector, generally a skeletal muscle. And the effector is going to respond to that signal from the CNS. Okay, so here's an example of a reflex arc. We have sensory receptors here in the skin, and a stimulus is going to activate the receptors. So let's say something hot touches you. That signal is going to be transmitted through the sensory neuron up to the spinal cord right here in the gray matter, where it's going to synapse with an interneuron. This interneuron or interneurons, could be two of them here. One would take the the information up the spinal cord to the brain. In this example, it's just a single neuron, so that's what's happening here. And this axon is communicating with a motor neuron here in the spinal cord. This motor neuron is going to be excited and is going to transmit that impulse to a skeletal muscle, which is going to contract to remove your hand from the hot object that's burning your skin. All right, there's a lot of different ways you can classify spinal reflexes. You can classify, a reflex in general. You can classify it as either a spinal reflex or a cranial reflex. So that's asking whether the spinal cord or the brain is the integration center for the reflex. You can classify it as a somatic reflex or a visceral reflex. Is the effector a skeletal muscle, or is it visceral in nature? So is it smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, a gland? Is the reflex monosynaptic or polysynaptic? So do sensory neurons synapse directly with motor neurons? So that would be monosynaptic or one synapse. Or are there interneurons involved? That would be polysynaptic, so multiple synapses. Is the reflex ipsilateral or contralateral? So are the receptor and effector on the same side of the body? That would be ipsilateral. Or on opposite sides? That would be contralateral. Is the reflex innate or is it acquired? Are you born with it or do you develop it after birth? Now, out of all of these classifications, the two I want you to focus on knowing are the monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes and the ipsilateral and contralateral classification of reflexes. All right, here is an example of monosynaptic versus polysynaptic reflex. Here in the monosynaptic reflex, you can see here's our sensory neuron. It detects stretch. It sends that signal here through the spinal cord and directly onto a motor neuron. The motor neuron is going to send an impulse to the effector organ, which is a skeletal muscle in this case, going to contract, and that's going to cause your reflex here, the knee-jerk reaction. A polysynaptic reflex, on the other hand, you have a sensory receptor, and you can see here there's a hot object burning the hand. Sensory receptor detects that. The sensory neuron transmits the signal into the spinal cord, where it synapses with an interneuron. So there's your first synapse. The interneuron then synapses with the motor neuron. There's your second synapse, so polysynaptic. The motor neuron is then going to take that signal, relay it to the effector organ, again a skeletal muscle in this case, and that organ is going to, that muscle is going to contract and pull the hand away from the hot object. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the stretch reflex. This is going to be the muscle contracting in response to a stretch. You can elicit this reflex by doing a tendon tap, which is going to be detected by a muscle spindle receptor. When this muscle spindle receptor is stretched, the spindle's sensory axon is going to fire impulses that are going to be relayed to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, that sensory axon is going to synapse with motor neurons of that very same muscle, and it's going to excite them, causing contraction of that muscle. At the same time, that sensory axon is going to synapse with interneurons that are going to inhibit motor neurons of the opposite muscle, the antagonist muscle, which would be the tricep in the biceps tendon example here. And let me show you how that works. Okay, so the stretch reflex. What happens is you've got a receptor here in a muscle or a tendon, let's say, and you have, let's say you tap the tendon. This receptor is going to detect that stretch. It's going to send it along the sensory neuron here. This is the cell body of the sensory neuron. And the sensory neuron is going to synapse with motor neuron of the same muscle and excite that motor neuron. And that motor neuron is going to cause contraction of this muscle. At the same time, the sensory neuron is synapsing with an interneuron, and this interneuron inhibits this motor neuron, F. And by inhibiting motor neuron F, you're going to inhibit contraction of the antagonist here, the antagonistic muscle, the flexor. And this is going to work to allow for quick reflex or response, contraction, full contraction from this extensor. All right, the Golgi tendon reflex. This is going to prevent muscles from contracting excessively. The Golgi tendon organ detects tension and is going to cause muscle relaxation. Golgi tendon organs are going to be proprioceptors with a sensory ending at the muscle tendon junction, and their sensory axons are going to excite interneurons in the spinal cord. Interneurons then are going to inhibit the motor neurons of that same muscle, so that's going to cause that muscle to relax, preventing it from damage. And at the same time, some excited interneurons are going to excite motor neurons of the antagonist muscle. This is called reciprocal activation, and the antagonist muscle is going to contract, and that again is going to help protect the muscles from overstretch. Okay, so here's the Golgi tendon reflex. You have muscle contraction that's increasing tension to these tendons, and that's going to be detected by the Golgi tendon organ. The signal is going to be relayed through the sensory neuron, and it travels to the CNS and the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, it's going to synapse with two interneurons. The first interneuron then synapses with the motor neuron to the same muscle and inhibits that motor neuron, so this same muscle relaxes. At the same time, it's synapsing with an interneuron that is communicating with the motor neuron of the antagonist muscle. And the antagonist muscle is going to contract, and this is called reciprocal activation. Okay, so I definitely want you to know the withdrawal reflex and the crossed extensor reflex. So the withdrawal reflex is going to pull a body part away from a painful stimulus. We've already kind of talked about this a little bit. The stimulus is going to excite a nociceptor sensory neuron, and all that means is a pain sensor neuron that's going to transmit that signal to the CNS, to the spinal cord, and excite interneurons in the spinal cord. The interneurons are going to excite motor neurons of flexors. So the flexor muscles are going to contract and withdraw the limb from the painful stimulus. At the same time, other interneurons are going to reciprocally inhibit motor neurons of extensors so that the extensor muscles relax and withdrawal can happen quickly. The crossed extensor reflex is going to occur in conjunction with the withdrawal reflex. What happens is some interneurons are going to be excited by that nociceptor sensory neuron, and they're going to cross the midline and excite extensor motor neurons on the other side of the body. So for example, as you withdraw your left leg, your right leg extends to give you some place to stand, okay? This allows the opposite side limb to support body weight while the hurt limb withdraws. And I'll show you what I mean right here. All right, so this diagram is showing us the withdrawal and crossed extensor reflexes. So let's start down here where the painful stimulus is. This person's just walking along, steps on something sharp. The sensory neuron in the foot is going to detect that painful stimulus, and it's going to relay that information to the spinal cord, right, to the CNS. And here it's going to synapse with two interneurons. The first interneuron is going to excite the motor neuron to the flexors, the motor neurons to the flexors on the same side of the body. And that's going to withdraw the limb from the painful stimulus. At the same time, that sensory neuron is synapsing with this interneuron that crosses the midline and excites motor neurons of the extensors of the opposite limb. So this limb, this leg, extends to give you some place to balance when you withdraw your foot. So why do we care about reflexes? Well, in addition to being defense mechanisms that we all have, they are useful for diagnostic reasons. Reflex testing can test the function of specific muscles, nerves, and spinal segments. If you have a hypoactive reflex, this means that your reflex is diminished or absent. This can indicate damage to the spinal cord, it can indicate muscle disease, or it can indicate some sort of problem with the neuromuscular junction itself. If you have a hyperactive reflex, this is an abnormally strong response, kind of an over response of the reflex. This can indicate damage to the brain or to the spinal cord, especially if clonus accompanies it. And clonus is going to be rhythmic oscillating movements of the limb with reflex testing. Okay, we're not going to talk about every nerve that comes off the spinal nerve and all of the different plexuses and things like that, but I do want to hit on a couple of examples here. So we're going to look at the brachial plexus, and we're going to look at the phrenic nerve. And what I want you to take away from this is how these nerves are formed from these the nerve roots that come out from the spinal cord. So here we have the brachial plexus, and this is the network of nerves that supply the entire upper limb. People who have a problem with their brachial plexus often have paralysis somewhere in their arm or forearm. Now, the brachial plexus is going to be composed of several different nerve roots, and I want you to know which ones. C5 through T1. These nerves come off of the spinal cord, and they're going to communicate with each other and form other nerves. And let me show you what I mean. Okay, let's start here. We have this diagram showing C5 nerve root, C6 nerve root, C7, C8, and the T1 nerve roots. Let's go up at the top. C5 nerve root is going to combine with C6's nerve root to form this trunk. This trunk is going to divide or split into divisions here. And you'll see it feeds these nerves down here, the axillary nerve and the radial nerve. C5 and C6 also feed these nerves, the musculocutaneous nerve and the median nerve. So let's say you had a lesion. Let's say you had something cut you and cut these nerves right here. You would lose all the function below that level. So you would lose function of your suprascapular and your subclavius nerves. You would lose function of your lateral pectoral nerves, and you would lose function of the musculocutaneous nerve, the median nerve, the axillary nerve, all of these guys, and the radial nerve. Okay, you would lose at least some function. See, you can see C7 also feeds the musculocutaneous and the axillary and the radial. So let's say C7 was not damaged. You would probably have some residual function in those nerves. And that's how it works. You can also see here C5, C6, and C7 are going to give contributions to the long thoracic nerve. Now, I don't want you to get caught up in the weeds. There's a lot that you can learn about the brachial plexus. You can learn the different palsies that result from the different nerve root lesions or different levels of damage to the nerves and what muscles that will affect in the arm and hand. Don't worry about that. What I want you to take away from this is just the general scheme, the general idea of how nerves leave the spinal cord and join together to form other nerves, okay? And how damage at one level is going to affect all of the nerve function distal to that damage. And remember, I want you to take away from this the nerve roots that are involved in the brachial plexus. You have C5 through T1. Please remember that. Okay, this is showing the terminal branches of the brachial plexus. So you have the musculocutaneous nerve. This guy's going to supply sensory information from the skin of the anterolateral forearm, and it's going to give muscular innervation to the brachialis, biceps brachii, and coracobrachialis. And we said if you had an issue with C5 and C6, you would lose some sensation, all sensation, in fact, to the musculocutaneous nerve. So you would lose sensation and you would lose motor function as well. And that's just one example. You can do this with all the different nerves and all the different muscles that they innervate. Again, don't worry about that. Just remember big picture stuff. This is how the nerves leave the spinal cord and how they join together to form peripheral nerves of the body. The next example I want to give you is that of the phrenic nerve. And I want you to know that the phrenic nerve is the nerve that innervates the diaphragm. This is the nerve that sends the impulse to contract the diaphragm so that you can breathe. And this phrenic nerve is going to be composed of the nerve roots of C3, C4, and C5. And you can see they all come together to form the phrenic nerve. And the way you remember that is C3, C4, C5 keeps the diaphragm alive.